So how much do designer babies cost? Well, this is part 2 of that conversation. And if you're wondering about the expense, it may not be what you're expecting. Stick around. Hello, I'm Corlandos Scott, and I am an assisted reproductive technologies attorney in Los Angeles. That simply means that I help people grow their family with the help of some science. Yeah. You know, things like surrogacy, egg donation, sperm donation. I handle the legal side of things so that my clients can leave the hospital with a wonderful, beautiful baby that maybe they didn't deliver, or they didn't use their sperm or eggs to create the embryos that resulted in that baby. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the cost of designer babies, but listen in real closely. First, we need to talk about the history of gene editing. We need to look at some regulations, and then we're going to look at the true costs of having a designer baby. Let's jump in. When I think about this topic, I get this huge image in my head of like one of the Star Wars movie sagas, IVF, the rise of gene editing. And I say that because it seems so bananas to think that we can actually do this. I'm still in awe of the idea that CRISPR exists, and it's truly a game-changing discovery. But it is only as game-changing as it is used for good. And so it's people harnessing its potential for good and remaining adherent, really, to some set of ethics and regulations that will make this truly a game changer in my book. All right, so let's take a quick walk down memory lane in the world of genes and DNA and all that good stuff. So we have 1958, DNA is made in a test tube. Pretty cool. In 1960s, we have more discovery and links in DNA. Then we have the good old 70s. That's when genetic engineering really took off unexpectedly. It was really during this time that we figured out how DNA works to protect itself. And that's really the basis for what we know today as genetic engineering therapies and CRISPR. Then also in the 70s, we have gene splicing experiments. And these experiments paved the way for recombinant DNA, or rDNA, you know, the cut and splice method. Think about Splice, the 2009 movie. Then we have the 80s. The 80s were really when we brought vaccines and treatments to humans in a major, major way. Now, the 80s became a period that cemented science's dedication to solving human problems using our own DNA. Then we have the 90s. In the 90s, the history of genetic engineering in humans really was made when the first chromosome was sequenced. And that brings us to someone we mentioned in part 1, the 2000s, and Adam Nash. He was the first human conceived using PGD, which pretty much made him the first quote-unquote designer baby. That brings us to the current day and to the roaring 2020s, where CRISPR really has taken off, and we've seen our first Nobel Prize for CRISPR. We've even seen people being able to be treated with diseases like sickle cell anemia through the technology of CRISPR. But with that comes some situations, and inevitably, regulations. Before we talk about regulations, let me know what you think. Is all of this CRISPR and gene editing and splicing and all that, does it sound scary to you? Where do you think we may go with this if, let's say, it's done the right way? Or what do you think we'll go with this if it's done the wrong way? Just comment below. I want to hear it. So whenever there's an advancement in science or technology, regulations and laws are not too far behind. So in 2019, we had the first US law passed to regulate the use of CRISPR. And you'd probably guess it was the state of California, and it was referred to as the Human Biohacking Bill. And the interesting thing about this law is that it went into effect on the heels of what many believe to be DIY gene editing situations. And I know you're thinking, wait, Corlandos, do it yourself gene editing? Yeah. There was an Oakland-based company called the Odin that sold genetic engineering supplies online. Yeah. The owner of this company kind of got some publicity in 2017 when he filmed himself injecting CRISPR into his own arm. Now, it wasn't long after that that he began to be investigated for practicing medicine without a license and for all kinds of other things. But safe to say that it definitely caught the attention of lawmakers. So the law in California took effect in January 2020, and that made it illegal to sell CRISPR gene therapy kits. Would you actually do that? Like, let me know below. If somebody gave you something to inject in your arm to alter your genes, would you do it? I'm just curious how successful his company could have been. So let's talk about what it costs to have a designer baby. And I know you're probably thinking, Corlandos, give me a dollar and cent amount. And yeah, we could talk about how much it costs to test, screen, diagnose embryos through PGD or PGS. Yes, we could talk about how much it costs to find the right egg donor for you that has the certain characteristics that you think are desirable in a donor, or a sperm donor, or an egg donor, or an embryo donor even. But let's talk about the real costs of designer babies. And that real cost doesn't necessarily come with a dollar-cent price tag. Let's talk about a Chinese scientist. In 2018, He Jiankui announced that he had successfully edited the genome of 2 babies after the baby's father, who had HIV, begged him to help them conceive healthy children. Now, he claimed that the babies would be born perfectly normal and healthy, and they'd never be susceptible to the dangers or stigma of an HIV infection. Now, he appeared to be driven by something good, and he's done something good with good intentions. Or maybe he didn't. The scientific community didn't necessarily look at it like that. Unfortunately for him, he was really just vilified by the research community, and they said that he committed grave abuse against human rights, and he created monstrosities, and he did unconscionable actions. No good deed goes unpunished. Most of the people who disagreed with him really disagreed with the fact that his experiment or his procedures were carried out largely in secret. There was nothing open about it. His experiment was a technological overreach, some said. Now, a lot went wrong, and international and ethical norms were violated. And unfortunately for him, he's currently serving jail time for illegal medical practices. So when we talk about the cost, for this scientist, the cost was his freedom. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm definitely excited about the possibilities of what gene editing can do for the human race. But my question is, at what cost? Okay, to have a baby's originally blonde hair changed to brunette by editing the baby's gene? Okay, fine. You want a baby that's taller, that's more light, that's more dark, that's more golden skin, a baby with almond-shaped eyes or double eyelids. And, these are probably minor cosmetic changes that normally you could make after the person's born through cosmetic surgery. Fine. So why go through it later if you can just edit the genes right before they come out? So what is really wrong with this? Well, for me, we're talking about the baby's consent. Now, the baby is the one who's going to have to live with the choices made by his or her parents. And the question becomes, do children automatically want the same thing as their parents? I mean, my wife and I talked about whether or not to even give our kids social media handles and accounts and names, because they really don't want them at 3 and 4 and 5 years old, and we're just getting them because we think it's cool. Should we really do it? So how much more so should we think about whether or not to edit a baby's genes based particularly on our preferences for cosmetic appearances? Well, many people look at that on 2 different sides. They say, well, you could say the same thing, Corlandos, about choosing an egg donor or choosing a sperm donor. But I think it's a question that we have to explore. Not only is there a question about the consent of the child, but it also brings up that uncomfortable topic of eugenics and creating a utopian society that is filled with the perfect type of person, whatever that perfect type of person is in someone's opinion. There's even maybe a question of, is it fair to bring into the world a group of genetically engineered babies who are guaranteed to be smarter, better, faster, more physically fit than other people? What will that do to general society? Well, these are questions that none of us have the answers to, but these are the types of questions that, believe it or not, we have to start asking as the science goes more and more into what used to be considered science fiction. I wish I had a final answer on all this, but I don't. I'm still sorting through some of these thoughts myself. So I'll leave the final question to you. Tell me what you think. Do you think it's worth it? I'd love to see your comment below. If you're thinking about growing your family through assisted reproductive technologies like egg donation, embryo donation, surrogacy, even sperm donation, and you're having questions about how to proceed, just reach out. I'd love to hear from you and answer your questions. So click the link below and you'll be taken to a forum where you can reach out to me and we can get in touch about your journey to becoming a parent.